White female CEO mocked a black mechanic. Fix this engine and I'll marry you. Then he did. The room exploded in laughter the moment she said it. Not nervous laughter, not polite laughter, the kind of laughter that cuts like a blade. Vivian Hartwell, just 29, CEO of a billion-dollar engineering empire, pointed straight at the only black man in the boardroom, the quiet maintenance mechanic sitting alone in the back. "If you can fix this engine design," she snapped, "I'll marry you myself." The board doubled over. The hired white expert mechanic smirked. Someone whispered, "He probably thinks an engine is a blender." But the room froze when the man they mocked stood up. Darius Cole rose slowly, calmly, like someone who had nothing left to fear and everything to reveal. He wasn't invited to that meeting. He wasn't supposed to sit in that chair. He wasn't supposed to speak. But today, the man they overlooked was about to save the company they worshipped. And what happened next would turn their world completely upside down. Welcome to Black Courageous Stories, a home for our voices, our strength, and our truth. Tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe if you stand with justice, dignity, and humanity. And tell us, where are you watching from? Let's connect with you. The boardroom of Hartwell Engineering felt like the inside of a pressure cooker ready to explode. A multi-million-dollar engine design had failed for the third consecutive time, and every face around that polished glass table showed fear. Fear of losing clients, fear of losing investments, fear of losing the legacy left behind by the late founder of the company. Vivian Hartwell, his only daughter, only 29 years old, sat at the head of the table with trembling hands hidden beneath the desk. The board doubted her. Investors whispered about replacing her. Every minute felt like she was trying to live up to a father she could never replace. At the center of their panic sat David Morrison, the acclaimed mechanical engineer they'd hired from MIT for $200,000, specifically to solve this exact problem. His reputation preceded him. Harvard undergraduate, MIT graduate degree, published researcher, consultant to Fortune 500 companies. But today, David's usually confident demeanor had evaporated like steam from an overheated engine. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the perfectly controlled 72-degree climate. His expensive tablet lay abandoned beside scattered blueprints that looked more like abstract art than engineering solutions. The revolutionary engine design that was supposed to revolutionize automotive efficiency and secure their place in the electric vehicle, revolution, had instead become their potential death sentence. 3 prototypes had failed catastrophically during investor demonstrations. Millions in development costs had evaporated. Their reputation for innovation was crumbling in real time. "The thermal dynamics are more complex than our initial modeling suggested," David stammered, his voice cracking with the strain of defending the indefensible. "The computational models indicate significant challenges in the heat dissipation matrix that require additional consultation with specialized firms." "Stop with the technical babble," Vivian snapped, her voice sharp with 3 nights of sleepless panic. "Can you fix it or not? I have investors arriving in 2 hours expecting solutions, not excuses." The white professional mechanic they'd hired, the one they'd paid a fortune to translate David's designs into working reality, stood at the front of the room fumbling with diagrams he clearly didn't understand. He wiped sweat from his forehead and muttered under his breath, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Nothing works in this place. These foreign designs are garbage, probably made by people who've never seen a real engine." Thomas Bradley, a senior engineer with 30 years of experience and a barely concealed contempt for change, leaned forward with a smirk. "Maybe the machine's racist too. Won't work for the wrong kind of people." The room snickered. Uncomfortable laughter that revealed more about their assumptions than they realized. But not everyone in that room had been invited to witness their corporate meltdown. At the back, in a chair he'd occupied for exactly 4 minutes, sat the company's maintenance mechanic, Darius Cole. 42 years old, 6 feet tall, with calloused hands that spoke of honest work, and dark eyes that missed nothing, despite their owner's apparent invisibility. He had arrived 30 minutes earlier to replace a malfunctioning sensor in the boardroom's climate control system, a 15-minute job that he'd completed in 10 with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything he did. But as he prepared to leave, the air conditioning in the hallway had begun making the grinding noise that suggested imminent failure, and the boardroom offered temporary refuge from the building's mechanical chaos. He hadn't intended to eavesdrop, hadn't planned to observe their crisis. But as he sat quietly, waiting for the hallway system to stabilize, the blueprints spread across their table had caught his attention with magnetic force. What they couldn't see was the man behind the maintenance uniform. What they didn't know was that 15 years earlier, a younger Darius had walked across a stage in Kingston, Jamaica, to receive his bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering with highest honors. That 3 years after that, he'd completed his master's at MIT with a thesis that had impressed professors who'd called his work revolutionary. They didn't know about the breakthrough designs he'd created at Stevens Engineering in Detroit, innovations that had improved efficiency ratings by 18% and saved the company $47 million in development costs. They especially didn't know why a man with 17 patents and research published in the most prestigious engineering journals had ended up fixing air conditioners and replacing burnt-out fluorescent bulbs. Darius didn't speak, didn't move, didn't disturb their increasingly desperate meeting. He only watched carefully, watched as professionals with impressive credentials argued over a blueprint that revealed problems he could solve in his sleep. The thermal load distribution was backwards. The stress points were concentrated at the weakest structural elements. The harmonic vibrations would create resonance patterns that would tear the system apart within 45 minutes of operation. It was the kind of mistake that happened when brilliant theorists worked in isolation from practical application, when computer models replaced hands-on experience and academic prestige, substituted for intuitive understanding of how machines actually behaved under real-world stress. But Darius had learned long ago that speaking up in rooms like this only created problems for men who looked like him. Rebecca Martinez, a junior engineer fresh from Stanford with idealism still intact, noticed him first. She'd been hired just 3 months ago and hadn't yet learned the unspoken rules about hierarchies and invisible people. "Excuse me," she said, turning in her chair with genuine confusion, "but why is maintenance sitting in on our engineering crisis meeting?" The question landed like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples of discomfort that spread across the room in concentric circles of embarrassment and annoyance. Heads turned toward Darius with expressions ranging from confused to irritated to outright hostile. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as attention focused on the man they'd forgotten was there. Thomas Bradley's voice carried the dismissive authority of someone accustomed to putting people in their place. "Why are you sitting here? Don't you have toilets to unclog or something equally appropriate?" Another engineer, Jason Wright, chimed in with barely concealed disdain. "Maybe he thinks it's a training session. You know how they get confused about their level." The intern, Marcus Webb Jr., son of a board member and beneficiary of nepotism he'd never acknowledged, whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Probably doesn't even know what an engine is. Thinks it's some kind of fancy blender." Darius felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the same constriction he'd experienced in countless similar moments over the past decade. His eyes lowered for just a split second, not in shame, but in the quiet pain of being reminded once again that his presence was unwelcome, unexpected, and fundamentally unwanted. But he'd developed armor against their casual cruelty. "I was just finishing the climate control repair," he said quietly, his voice carrying the slight accent of someone who'd learned English as a second language, but spoke it with careful precision. "The hallway system is malfunctioning. I'll be going now." "No, wait a minute," Thomas Bradley interjected with the kind of cruel entertainment that comes from kicking someone already down. "Since you're here and seem so fascinated by our work, maybe you have some insights to share. After all, you probably know as much about advanced engineering as our expensive consultant here." The sarcasm in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. Several board members chuckled, grateful for any relief from the mounting pressure of their technical crisis. Jason Wright picked up the thread with malicious glee. "Yeah, maybe the janitor can solve what MIT graduates can't figure out. I'm sure his extensive experience with mop buckets has given him unique perspectives on thermal dynamics." But it was Vivian who who delivered the killing blow. Exhausted from 3 sleepless nights, humiliated by the impending disaster, and desperate to deflect attention from her own failures as a leader, she turned toward Darius with a cruel smile that didn't reach her eyes. The weight of her father's legacy pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. The whispered conversations about her competence echoed in her ears. The quarterly reports that showed declining confidence in her leadership sat like accusations on her desk. In that moment of corporate desperation, she needed someone to blame. Someone to mock, someone to make smaller so she could feel larger. Her gaze fixed on Darius like a predator selecting prey. "You know what?" she said, her voice cutting through the room like breaking glass, carrying the authority of inherited power and the cruelty of cornered desperation. "Since our expert can't solve this problem, and you seem so interested in our blueprints—" She paused, letting the mockery build like pressure in a boiler, enjoying the anticipation on her colleagues' faces as they prepared to witness someone's complete humiliation. "Fine. If you can fix this engine design." Her finger pointed at him like an accusation, like a weapon, like a judgment of his fundamental unworthiness. The words hung in the air like a loaded gun. "I'll marry you myself." The room exploded in laughter. Not the warm laughter of shared joy, but the harsh, mocking laughter of people kicking someone already on the ground. It echoed off the glass walls and polished surfaces, multiplying until it felt like an auditory assault designed to strip away dignity and humanity. Thomas Bradley nearly fell off his chair. "This is rich. The janitor thinks he can solve million-dollar engineering problems." Jason Wright wiped tears from his eyes. "Maybe we should give him a crayon so he can draw us some pictures." The intern whispered loudly, "This is going to be good. Let the maintenance man play engineer for a minute before he goes back to changing light bulbs." But through it all, Darius didn't laugh. He didn't even blink. For half a second, his eyes lowered, not in shame, but in the quiet pain of being reminded once again that in their world, he would always be the punchline, never the solution. The laughter washed over him like acid rain, each chuckle another reminder of his place in their hierarchy. But underneath the humiliation, something else stirred, something that had been buried under years of forced invisibility but had never truly died. 15 years of suppressed genius, 17 patents worth millions, innovations that had shaped industries while he remained invisible in the footnotes, solutions to problems these people couldn't begin to understand, hidden behind a work uniform they used to justify their blindness. He thought of his father's words, "Machines don't lie. People do." He thought of Professor Chen telling him he had the mind of an innovator. He thought of every stolen idea, every dismissed suggestion, every moment when his expertise had been ignored because it came packaged in skin the wrong color. And in that moment, Darius Cole made a decision that would change everything. He stood up slowly, one heartbeat at a time. The laughter died like candle flames in a sudden wind. Because everyone in that room suddenly sensed they'd just awakened something they didn't understand, something they'd underestimated, something that might be far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. If you're hooked already and can feel the injustice building, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this, stories of justice, brilliance, and unexpected triumph. This is about to get intense. Have you ever been underestimated or mocked because of the way you look or where you work? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience matters and could inspire someone else facing the same struggles. Most people thought Darius's silence meant he was slow, or passive, or uneducated. They were about to discover that silence is its own kind of wisdom. He approached the conference table without rush, without fear, without apology. Each step carried the weight of a man who'd spent years proving himself to people who refused to see proof. The intern, Marcus Webb Jr., smirked. This should be hilarious. Thomas Bradley folded his arms. All right, big guy, show us how to do algebra. The hired white mechanic, David Morrison, stepped closer with desperate aggression. Listen, pal, real engineering isn't fixing leaky faucets. This is graduate-level computational fluid dynamics. He gestured dismissively. Stop staring and pretending you understand. This isn't your level. Jason Wright chimed in. Let maintenance handle the mop, not the math. But Darius didn't respond to their mockery. His attention was focused on the blueprints spread across the table like a roadmap to salvation they were too blind to read. The technical drawings called to him like a native language he'd been forbidden to speak for years. His mind began processing the information with the systematic efficiency of someone who'd designed similar systems in graduate school, who'd solved these exact problems for companies that had refused to acknowledge his contributions. "May I see the blueprint?" he asked quietly. His voice carrying none of the anger their treatment deserved, but all of the quiet authority that came from absolute certainty. They gave it to him because they thought it would entertain them. What they didn't expect was entertainment at their own expense. As Darius examined the technical drawings, memories flooded back with the clarity of yesterday. He was 8 years old again, sitting cross-legged on a concrete floor in Kingston, Jamaica, watching his father's weathered hands work magic on a broken motorcycle engine. "Darius," his father had said, wiping oil from his fingers with a cloth that had seen better days. "You see? Machines don't lie, people do." The old man's eyes had twinkled with the wisdom of someone who'd learned to read truth in the language of pistons and gears. "When engine broken, it tell you exactly what wrong. No politics, no pretending, just honest problems needing honest solutions." That memory carried him through another flashback, 15 years earlier, when a younger Darius had walked across the stage at MIT to receive his master's degree in mechanical engineering. His parents had saved for 3 years to witness that moment, his mother wearing her finest dress and his father in a borrowed suit that was slightly too large. Professor Elizabeth Chen had shaken his hand that day and whispered words that had shaped his understanding of his own potential. "You have the mind of an innovator, Darius. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." She'd seen something in his thesis work, a revolutionary approach to thermal dynamics that could transform engine design. She'd encouraged him to pursue patents, to start his own company, to change the world with ideas that were 20 years ahead of their time. He'd tried. God, how he'd tried. The memory fast-forwarded to his first job at Stevens Engineering in Detroit. Fresh out of MIT with honors, patents pending, and dreams that felt as solid as the engines he designed. For 6 months, everything had been perfect. His innovations had improved efficiency ratings by 18%. His designs had saved the company $47 million in development costs. His future had seemed limitless. Then came the promotion cycle and the lesson that credentials meant nothing without the right skin color. "We're going with Johnson for the lead engineer position," his supervisor had explained, avoiding eye contact with the practiced skill of someone delivering institutional racism in professional language. "He has more leadership presence. You understand?" Johnson, who'd graduated with a 3.2 GPA compared to Darius's 3.9, Johnson, who'd asked Darius to explain basic thermal coefficients during his second week. Johnson, whose skin was 3 shades lighter and whose accent carried no trace of another continent. The patents Darius had developed, reassigned to the team. The breakthrough designs that had revolutionized their product line, credited to collaborative innovation. The $47 million his genius had saved, invisible in the final reports that determined promotions and recognition. When Darius had complained to HR about being passed over despite superior qualifications, he'd been told he needed to work on his communication skills and cultural integration. When he'd pushed harder, asking for specific examples of deficiencies, his performance reviews had suddenly begun noting attitude problems and resistance to feedback. The message was clear. Accept invisibility or find another job. He'd found another job, and another, and another. Each position started with promise and ended with familiar disappointments. His expertise was valued until promotion time. His innovations were celebrated until credit was assigned. His worth was acknowledged until it came time to acknowledge it publicly. By the 5th company, the pattern was undeniable. By the 7th, it was soul-crushing. By the 10th, Darius had made a decision that would save his sanity but sacrifice his dreams. He'd become invisible by choice. Maintenance work was honest. When you fixed something, it stayed fixed. When you solved a problem, it stayed solved. No one questioned your competence when the air conditioning worked perfectly or the elevators ran smoothly. No one stole credit for properly calibrated heating systems or efficiently organized supply closets. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was a life where his worth wasn't constantly under attack. Now, looking at the blueprints that revealed problems he could solve in his sleep, Darius felt the familiar ache of wasted potential mixed with something new, an opportunity to prove, once and for all, that genius doesn't announce itself with degrees from prestigious universities. He looked at the blueprint once, twice. His dark eyes moved across the technical drawings with the practiced fluency of someone reading their native language after years of forced silence. And what he saw was both heartbreaking and infuriating, a brilliant design concept sabotaged by fundamental oversights that any hands-on engineer would have caught immediately. The thermal load distribution was completely backwards. Instead of dispersing heat through reinforced channels designed to handle stress, the current design concentrated all thermal energy at the weakest structural points. It was like trying to pour boiling water through tissue paper. The harmonic vibrations created by the engine's operation would set up resonance patterns that would literally shake the system apart. Within 45 minutes of operation, microfractures would compromise the cooling system integrity, causing the catastrophic thermal overload they'd been experiencing in every prototype. It was the kind of mistake that happened when brilliant theorists worked in isolation from practical application, when computer models replaced hands-on experience and academic credentials, substituted for intuitive understanding of how machines actually behaved under real-world conditions. But more than that, it revealed something that made Darius's heart race with recognition. This wasn't just any thermal engineering problem. This was a variation on research he'd published 7 years ago, work that had been ignored by the industry until a white researcher had rediscovered it and won awards for innovations that originated in Darius's graduate thesis. He placed his finger calmly on a small section near the thermal intake, his voice carrying quiet authority that hadn't been there before, or perhaps it had always been there, just ignored by people who couldn't see past their assumptions. "This is where it fails," he said softly, his words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "The pressure load here is unbalanced. This will collapse after 45 minutes of operation." The room went dead silent. They had expected fumbling. They had anticipated embarrassment. They'd prepared for entertainment at his expense. They hadn't prepared for expertise delivered with surgical precision. Thomas Bradley's smirk faltered. Jason Wright stopped laughing. The intern's confidence evaporated like morning mist. David Morrison, the $200,000 consultant whose reputation was built on solving exactly these kinds of problems, snatched the blueprint from Darius's hands with the desperation of someone watching their worldview crumble in real time. He reviewed the numbers with increasing panic, reviewed the stress calculations, reviewed the thermal dynamics, reviewed the conclusion that should have been obvious to someone with his credentials. His face went pale as comprehension dawned. "He's right," David whispered, the admission falling from his lips like a confession of professional incompetence. "The thermal stress concentration. Jesus Christ, how did we miss this?" The white mechanic they'd hired stepped forward, sweat now visible despite the perfectly controlled climate. No, this can't be right. He's just maintenance. He doesn't have the training to understand thermal coefficient analysis. This is graduate-level engineering." But Rebecca Martinez, the young engineer whose idealism hadn't yet been crushed by corporate politics, was already moving to the whiteboard. "Check his analysis. Run the calculations." They checked and checked and checked again. Every calculation was perfect. Every stress analysis was flawless. Every solution was elegant in its simplicity. The $200,000 consultant they'd hired couldn't solve what the maintenance worker had diagnosed in 30 seconds. But Darius wasn't done. With movements that betrayed years of standing at whiteboards and conference rooms they'd never imagined he belonged in, he took a marker and began redrawing the thermal distribution network. His hand moved with practiced precision, creating clean lines that transformed their catastrophic failure into elegant optimization. What emerged wasn't just a correction. It was a masterpiece of engineering design. A solution that didn't just fix their problem, but elevated their entire engine performance beyond what the original designers had thought possible. "The primary issue," he began, his voice taking on the rhythm of someone who'd explained complex concepts countless times before, "is that you're treating this as a thermal problem when it's actually a structural dynamics issue that manifests as thermal failure." He drew connected arrows showing force distribution patterns that revealed the true nature of their crisis. The engine mount configuration creates harmonic vibrations during operation. These vibrations set up resonance patterns that create microfractures in the thermal channel walls. Thomas Bradley found himself leaning forward despite his prejudice, his engineering background forcing him to recognize the sophistication of the analysis. But if that's true, then our entire mounting system would need— "Not redesigned," Darius interrupted gently, adding modification details with casual precision. "Just harmonically dampened. Add dampening elements here, here, and here." His pen marked 3 specific locations. "Relocate the primary thermal channels to follow natural stress distribution rather than fighting against it." He turned the blueprint and began sketching additional optimizations with the fluid confidence of someone drawing from deep wells of experience. "This reconfiguration maintains your manufacturing timeline while eliminating 93% of thermal stress. Materials cost increase is negligible, maybe 2%, but performance improvement should exceed original targets by at least 15%. The room watched in stunned amazement as their disaster transformed into revolutionary breakthrough before their eyes. Jason Wright's voice was barely audible. "Where did you learn to do this?" Darius paused in his sketching, his eyes meeting the engineer's gaze across a table that had become a bridge between worlds. For a moment, everyone saw something flicker in his expression, not anger, but a deep sadness that spoke of dreams deferred and potential wasted by people too blind to recognize genius when it wore work boots instead of designer suits. "Same place as everyone else in this room, I imagine," he said quietly. "School." If this moment shocked you and you can feel the power shift happening, go ahead and smash that subscribe button, because this story only gets more intense from here. And hit that like button if you believe talent can come from the most unexpected places. Would you have stood up like Darius did or stayed silent? What would it take for you to reveal your hidden talents in a room full of people who've already judged you? Share your thoughts below. The temperature in the boardroom seemed to drop 10 degrees as the reality of what they'd witnessed began to sink in. They had entered looking for someone to blame. Now they were staring at evidence that the solution had been sitting quietly in their room for 3 years. Rebecca Martinez pulled out her tablet and began running calculations. After 5 minutes, she looked up with shock. "The stress distributions, they're perfect. This isn't just a fix, this is optimization at a level I've never seen before." Thomas Bradley snatched the tablet. "These harmonic dampening calculations, this is graduate-level systems engineering." David Morrison stepped closer, terrified. What he saw made his expertise seem elementary, but the racist assumptions fought back desperately. The white mechanic spat. "He's guessing. There's no way a maintenance man could understand computational fluid dynamics." Jason Wright nodded. "He's just repeating solutions he doesn't understand, like a parrot." Marcus Webb Jr. pushed further. "Maybe this is some kind of setup. Look at him. Does he look like someone who went to engineering school?" The room's discomfort with these overtly racist comments was palpable, but no one challenged them directly. Instead, they turned to the one source that could provide objective truth: Darius's personnel file. Vivian's assistant was already pulling up his employment records, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard with corporate efficiency. The room held its collective breath as she navigated through databases that contained the truth they'd never bothered to investigate. "I'm accessing his complete employment file now," she announced, her voice tight with the anticipation of revelation. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, filled only by the quiet hum of air conditioning and the distant sounds of a city that had no idea a revolution was taking place 23 floors above the street. And then Sandra Martinez, the HR director, made a sound that was part gasp, part whisper, part prayer. "Oh my God," she breathed, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of institutional failure that could no longer be denied. Every head in the room turned toward her like flowers following sunlight, their faces reflecting hope and terror in equal measure. "He has a master's degree in mechanical engineering," she said, her voice growing stronger as the implications crashed over her like waves. "From MIT, graduated magna cum laude." The room gasped like air being sucked from a vacuum chamber. "Published research in the International Journal of Advanced Engineering Sciences," she continued, each revelation landing like a physical blow to their assumptions. "3 patents in thermal dynamics optimization filed under his name. Award recipient for the International Innovation Prize in Sustainable Engine Design." Thomas Bradley's face went white. Jason Wright's confident smirk died like a candle flame in the wind. The intern looked like he might vomit from the sheer cognitive dissonance of his worldview colliding with objective reality. But Sandra wasn't finished reading the litany of their collective blindness. Previous employment includes senior design engineer at Stevens Engineering, principal engineer at Morrison Technologies, lead innovation specialist at Advanced Automotive Solutions. Each position represented a level of expertise that surpassed most of their senior staff. Each company was a household name in automotive innovation. Each role was the kind of career achievement that executives spent decades pursuing. "His thesis work," Sandra continued, her voice now trembling with the recognition of how completely they'd failed, was titled "Revolutionary Approaches to Thermal Dynamics in High-Performance Engine Design." The research has been cited in over 400 academic papers and formed the foundation for multiple industry breakthroughs. David Morrison, whose family name was on one of the companies listed in Darius's employment history, suddenly went completely pale. What years was he at Morrison Technologies? Sandra checked the file. 2018 to 2020, listed as principal design engineer and primary researcher on Project Prometheus. David's hands began shaking uncontrollably. Project Prometheus, that was the thermal efficiency breakthrough that revolutionized our entire product line. The innovation that saved the company $18 million in development costs and established our reputation in sustainable automotive technology. He turned to stare at Darius with the expression of someone seeing a ghost. "That was your design? The revolutionary thermal management system that we've been licensing to competitors for the past 3 years that originated from your research?" Darius nodded once. A simple acknowledgement of authorship that had been stolen, repackaged, and sold back to the industry that had rejected him. "Yes, that was my design." The words landed like physical blows throughout the room. The technology that had shaped their understanding of modern engine design, the innovations that had influenced millions in investment decisions, the breakthrough that had been credited to teams of white engineers, all of it had originated from the mind of the man they'd been mocking as just maintenance. But the revelations weren't finished. "According to his file," Sandra said, her voice now barely audible, "he holds 17 registered patents in automotive engineering, with another 12 currently pending approval. His innovations have generated approximately $147 million in licensing revenue for his previous employers. 17 patents, $147 million in revenue. Innovations that had shaped entire industries while the innovator himself remained invisible in corporate footnotes and dismissed as disposable labor." The room sat in stunned silence as they processed not just his qualifications, but the scope of the systematic injustice that had brought him to their basement. This wasn't just a case of overlooking talent. This was industrial-scale exploitation of genius by people who couldn't recognize brilliance when it didn't come wrapped in their assumptions about who deserved recognition. Vivian felt tears forming in her eyes, not tears of frustration or professional panic, but tears of shame at being complicit in a system that could waste someone so completely. The man she'd mocked, the person she'd used as a punchline in her moment of desperate humiliation, was more qualified to run their entire engineering department than she was to run the company. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of realization. "Why didn't you fight for recognition? Why didn't you demand the positions you deserved? Why didn't you—" She trailed off as the obvious answer became clear. He had fought. He'd fought for recognition in corporate boardrooms just like this one. He'd presented his innovations to executives who looked exactly like the people surrounding this table. He'd pushed for promotions and credit and basic acknowledgement of his contributions. And he'd been systematically crushed by the same prejudice they'd just demonstrated in real time. Darius looked around the room at faces that had transformed from mockery to shock to something approaching recognition. But he'd seen this transformation before, and he knew how quickly it could reverse when the immediate crisis passed and comfortable assumptions reasserted themselves. "I did fight," he said, his voice carrying years of exhaustion that came from battling systems designed to render him invisible. "For the first 8 years of my career, I fought every day. I spoke up in meetings exactly like this one. I presented my ideas with passion and precision. I pushed for promotions based on documented performance." He paused, gathering strength for words he'd never spoken aloud in a corporate setting. "And every single time, I was told I needed to work on my communication skills. Every innovation I created was reassigned to colleagues who could present them more effectively to leadership. Every promotion I earned was given to someone who demonstrated better cultural fit." The accusations hung in the air without malice, delivered with the simple honesty of someone recounting documented history rather than making emotional appeals. "After the 10th time, I watched my work get credited to white colleagues. After the 15th time, I was passed over for promotions I'd earned. After the 20th time, I was told that my expertise needed refinement. I made a choice. I chose invisible work that couldn't be stolen. I chose competence that couldn't be denied. I chose dignity over recognition." He looked directly at Vivian, his dark eyes meeting her blue ones across a table that had become a bridge between two completely different worlds. "And until today," he said quietly, "that choice served me well." The room sat in absolute silence, processing the scope of their collective failure and the magnitude of what they'd just discovered sitting in their basement for 3 years. They weren't just looking at a qualified engineer. They weren't just looking at overlooked talent. They were looking at one of the most innovative minds in automotive engineering, whose genius had been systematically exploited and then discarded by an industry too blind to see past their own prejudices. And they had just spent the morning treating him like a punchline to a cruel joke. If you're watching and your heart is racing with anger at this injustice, subscribe right now so more stories like this reach you every single week. This is exactly the kind of content that opens eyes and changes minds. Do you think Darius should have told them about his degree early, or was he right to stay quiet after being burned so many times? What would you have done in his situation? Drop your thoughts below. Just when Vivian thought the morning couldn't become more surreal, the conference room doors opened with the quiet authority of serious money. 3 investors entered, people whose confidence could make or break entire companies. Marcus Webb represented $40 million in development capital. Dr. Sarah Chen specialized in revolutionary technologies. James Peterson controlled $800 million in sustainable transportation funds. "Vivian," Marcus said, "we came early because we heard there might be significant developments." He paused, taking in the scene. Blueprints transformed with modifications, a black man in maintenance clothes at the head of the table, and executives who looked like they'd witnessed something impossible. "What exactly is happening here?" asked Dr. Chen. Before Vivian could explain, David Morrison saw a desperate opportunity. He began gathering Darius's blueprints. "Actually," he said quickly, "I was just explaining my breakthrough analysis. I've identified the root cause and developed comprehensive solutions." But Dr. Chen had spent 20 years identifying genuine innovation. "These modifications are written in completely different handwriting," she said, examining the work. "The analytical approach is entirely different from anything I've seen from your team." She traced the elegant solutions. "This level of integration, this is MIT or Stanford level work. Who actually created these modifications?" The question focused like a laser beam on the lie that David was attempting to construct. Marcus Webb joined her at the table, his experienced eye immediately recognizing the difference between the corporate mediocrity he'd been funding and the breakthrough innovation now spread before him. James Peterson, whose $800 million fund had been built on identifying genius before it became obvious, leaned in to examine the work more closely. What he saw made him reassess everything he thought he knew about Hartwell Engineering's capabilities. Furthermore, Dr. Chen continued, her voice carrying increasing excitement as she recognized the sophistication of what she was examining. This harmonic dampening solution is remarkably similar to groundbreaking research I've encountered in international engineering publications. The methodology was revolutionary. It pioneered approaches to thermal management that influenced development strategies across the entire automotive sector. She paused, her mind connecting dots that painted an increasingly clear picture. The lead researcher on that foundational work was Dr. D. Cole. His innovations transformed theoretical understanding of thermal dynamics in ways that shaped investment decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But his publications mysteriously stopped appearing several years ago, which always puzzled the academic community. Her eyes moved from the blueprints to scan the faces around the room, searching for explanations that were hiding in plain sight. All eyes turned to Darius, who stood quietly beside the conference table with the dignity of someone who'd learned not to expect credit, but had never stopped deserving it. Dr. Cole, Dr. Chen said, and the title carried the weight of recognition that had been absent from every previous conversation in that room. I've read your research extensively. Your paper on sustainable thermal dynamics influenced our entire investment strategy in automotive technology. She studied his face with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle that revealed institutional failures of staggering proportions. What are you doing here? The question wasn't accusatory. It was genuinely bewildered. Dr. Chen understood the landscape of engineering talent, and she was looking at someone whose research had shaped multi-million-dollar investment decisions across the industry while apparently working in corporate anonymity. Darius met her gaze steadily, his voice carrying quiet dignity earned through years of invisible excellence. I'm working, Dr. Chen, same as everyone else. But Marcus Webb was already connecting dots that painted an increasingly devastating picture of institutional failure that bordered on criminal negligence of talent. Vivian, he said, his voice carrying the cold precision that venture capitalists used when delivering verdicts that could destroy careers. Are you telling me that you've had Dr. Darius Cole, the researcher whose innovations have generated hundreds of millions in industry revenue and influenced entire sectors of automotive development, working in your maintenance department? The question was a corporate death sentence delivered in conversational tones. Vivian felt her career, her company, and her family's legacy disintegrating in real time as the scope of their institutional blindness became impossible to deny. His personnel file, she stammered, but words felt inadequate to explain 3 years of systematic failure to recognize genius that had been sitting in their basement. We never looked, Thomas Bradley admitted quietly, the confession falling like a stone into still water. We never bothered to investigate his background beyond basic employment verification. We never asked, added Jason Wright, his earlier racism now transformed into shame that made him unable to meet anyone's eyes. Dr. Chen turned back to Darius with the respect accorded to peer-level expertise and intellectual collaboration. Dr. Cole, would you walk us through your analysis of their engine design problems? I'd like to understand your diagnostic methodology and proposed solutions. And for the first time in 3 years, Darius was invited to use his mind for its intended purpose. What followed was 25 minutes of technical explanation that demonstrated mastery at levels that transformed everyone's understanding of what they'd been witnessing. This wasn't just problem-solving, this was innovation at the cutting edge of what was possible in automotive engineering. Darius didn't just break down the engine's failures, he reconstructed the entire approach from first principles, explaining his solutions with the fluidity of someone teaching concepts he'd pioneered. He drew diagrams that made complex theories accessible to general audiences while remaining rigorous enough to satisfy PhD-level technical scrutiny. He outlined implementation strategies that could revolutionize not just their current crisis, but their entire approach to sustainable transportation. His explanations revealed layers of expertise that went far beyond fixing their immediate problems. He was showing them pathways to innovations that could reshape entire markets. The investors asked increasingly sophisticated questions designed to test the depth of his knowledge, and Darius answered each one with casual brilliance that made advanced engineering concepts seem elementary. His responses revealed not just technical competence, but strategic understanding of market applications that could translate innovations into industry-changing businesses. "The manufacturing modifications I've outlined," he explained, sketching secondary optimizations that addressed efficiency issues the original designers hadn't even recognized as problems, should improve fuel efficiency by approximately 22% while reducing emissions output by nearly 30%. But more importantly, the production changes are minimal, mostly optimizing casting molds and adjusting assembly sequences. Dr. Chen and Marcus Webb exchanged the kind of look that passed between people who'd just witnessed something that could reshape their entire investment strategy. "Dr. Cole," Marcus said, his voice carrying the tone reserved for negotiations that could launch new industries, "we'd like to discuss a comprehensive partnership opportunity with you directly. Your approach to these problems suggests possibilities for developments that could revolutionize automotive efficiency standards and create entirely new market categories." He turned to Vivian with the cold professionalism of someone delivering a verdict that would reshape corporate hierarchies. "Vivian, we'll be restructuring our investment agreements effective immediately. Dr. Cole will be assuming leadership of all engineering development initiatives, with full authority over technical decisions, team composition, and strategic direction." It was a corporate coup executed with venture capital efficiency. Darius had gone from invisible maintenance worker to chief engineering authority in the space of one morning, while the executives who'd mocked him watched their assumptions about merit and hierarchy evaporate like steam from overheated engines. But the most devastating blow was still coming. James Peterson, whose $800 million fund gave him the authority to reshape entire companies, smiled with the kind of satisfaction that comes from witnessing perfect justice. "About that offer," he said, turning back to Darius with slight amusement that carried the weight of cosmic irony. "Didn't someone promise to marry you if you fixed their engine problem?" The laughter that followed wasn't mocking this time. It was the complicated laughter of people witnessing justice delivered with surgical precision and poetic completeness. Vivian's face burned with humiliation that was exponentially more intense than anything she'd inflicted on Darius just hours earlier. The mockery she'd delivered in front of her board was now being returned with compound interest in front of the people who controlled her company's future. If you want to see the most satisfying conclusion ever, make sure you're subscribed right now. This story is about to deliver justice that will give you chills. And smash that like button if you believe talent deserves recognition regardless of where it's found. Should Vivian face consequences for her earlier behavior? What would real accountability look like in this situation? Share your thoughts below. The boardroom had become a courtroom where justice was being served without judges or juries. Just the simple power of truth finally being allowed to speak. Vivian's humiliation was complete, but it was Darius's response that revealed the true measure of both their characters. "Thank you for the recognition," he said quietly, his voice carrying dignity that had sustained him through years of invisibility. "But I'm not interested in that particular offer." He looked directly at Vivian. "I'm interested in doing work that matters, with people who see its value." The refusal was gentle but absolute, delivered without malice but with quiet authority. For Vivian, those words hurt more than any insult could have. They weren't rejection born of spite. They were rejection born of principle. When only the two of them remained, Vivian approached with hesitant steps. "I misjudged you completely," she said. "I was scared. The company was failing, and I took my fear out on someone who didn't deserve it." Darius nodded once. "I wasn't staring at you. I was studying the engineering problems you couldn't solve. I don't want anything from you," he said firmly. "Not marriage, not pity, not guilty favors. I want the opportunity I've already earned." Those words would echo in Vivian's mind for the rest of her career and beyond. Not the opportunity he'd been given out of investor pressure or legal obligation, but the opportunity his mind, his innovations, and his expertise had already earned through merit that had been systematically ignored by people too blind to see past their own assumptions. The transformation that followed wasn't immediate or dramatic. Real institutional change never is. But over the following months, as Darius settled into his new role as Chief Innovation Officer and co-owner of equity shares that reflected his actual contributions, something fundamental shifted in the company's entire approach to recognizing and nurturing talent. He introduced hiring practices that prioritized demonstrated competence over educational pedigree and social connections. When he created evaluation systems that measured actual innovation rather than the ability to present ideas in ways that conformed to upper management expectations. He built an environment where the quality of solutions mattered more than the accent or appearance of the person proposing them. Under his technical leadership, the company didn't just solve their immediate crisis, they revolutionized their entire approach to automotive engineering. The engine design that had nearly destroyed them became the foundation for patents worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Their efficiency innovations positioned them years ahead of competitors who were still using approaches that Darius had surpassed a decade earlier. Clients returned, drawn by technical breakthroughs they couldn't find anywhere else in the industry. Investors renewed their confidence, impressed by innovations that opened entirely new market possibilities. The company that had been failing under the weight of inherited mediocrity began thriving under leadership that prioritized substance over style. And slowly, gradually, something else changed too. Vivian changed. The young CEO, who had once relied on inherited authority and defensive arrogance, began building her own genuine competence. She asked questions instead of pretending to have answers she didn't possess. She listened to expertise regardless of its source. She stayed late not out of panic and desperation, but out of genuine engagement with work that finally felt meaningful and collaborative. She began to see the company through Darius's eyes, not as a family legacy to be protected from change, but as an opportunity to build something better than what they'd inherited. Not as a hierarchy to be defended, but as a community of people working together to solve problems that mattered. In those late nights, working on projects that could reshape entire industries, she often found herself collaborating with the man she'd once mocked. Not as CEO giving orders to an employee, but as partners solving challenges that required both of their different kinds of expertise. She watched him transform not just their technology and their profit margins, but their entire organizational culture. She saw how he treated every person with genuine respect, regardless of their position in the corporate hierarchy. She witnessed the kind of leadership that inspired loyalty through competence and integrity rather than demanding obedience through authority and fear. And somewhere in those shared victories and collaborative breakthroughs, professional respect became personal friendship. Friendship became deep trust. Trust became something more profound, not romantic in the conventional sense, but the kind of connection that exists between people who've learned to see each other clearly and value what they find there. 2 years later, when Darius asked Vivian to marry him, it wasn't because of a cruel joke or corporate desperation. It was because they'd built the kind of partnership that genuine love requires, based on mutual respect, shared values, and the understanding that comes from working together to create something better than either of them could achieve alone. Their wedding was small and intimate, witnessed by employees who'd watched their journey from conflict to collaboration to something beautiful. The ceremony took place not in the boardroom where their story had begun with mockery and humiliation, but in the research facility they'd built together, a space dedicated to the principle that innovation comes from recognizing and nurturing talent wherever it's found. If this transformation moved you, you absolutely must subscribe and share this story with everyone who needs to hear it. This is what real change looks like. And these stories remind us what's possible when we choose growth over prejudice. Do you believe people can truly change and grow beyond their worst moments? What does real partnership look like to you? Share your thoughts below. Your perspective matters. 5 years after that morning in the boardroom, Hartwell Engineering had become something completely different from the failing company that had nearly collapsed under the weight of its own institutional blindness. The same conference room where Vivian had once mocked Darius now hosted meetings where ideas mattered more than the credentials of the people presenting them. The walls displayed patents and innovations that bore his name alongside discoveries made by engineers he'd mentored, people whose talents might have remained invisible under the old systems that prioritized appearance over ability. The company had become a model for what was possible when organizations chose to see past their assumptions and invest in the potential they'd been trained to overlook. Their success hadn't just transformed their own corporate culture, it had influenced hiring and evaluation practices throughout their industry. At the front of that transformed boardroom stood Vivian Hartwell Cole, no longer the frightened young CEO drowning in inherited expectations, but a confident leader who'd learned that true authority came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. Beside her stood Dr. Darius Cole, now Chief Innovation Officer, co-owner, and partner in every sense that mattered, not maintenance, not invisible, not underestimated, recognized, respected, essential. Their partnership had created more than just a successful business. It had become proof that the most powerful force in any organization isn't inherited privilege, institutional connections, or educational pedigree. It's the courage to see people clearly, value them fully, and give them the opportunities their talents deserve. As they looked out over a room filled with employees who loved their work and believed in their leadership, the narrator's voice settled on a truth that resonated far beyond their individual story. She once mocked the man who became her partner in every way that mattered. He once sat silently at the back of a room that he now leads beside her. Together, they rebuilt not just a company, but an understanding of what becomes possible when we choose to see the genius that exists everywhere around us. Their marriage wasn't the punchline to a cruel joke. It was the beginning of a partnership that would go on to revolutionize automotive engineering, create thousands of meaningful jobs, and prove that the most transformative innovations come not from excluding people who don't fit our expectations, but from including everyone whose talents we've been too blind to see. If this ending restored your faith in human potential and the power of recognition, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. This channel is dedicated to stories that remind us what's possible when we choose to see the best in each other. Share this story with someone who needs hope. What's the most important lesson from Darius and Vivian's journey? How can we all do better at recognizing hidden talent in our own lives? Let us know in the comments. Your insights could change someone's perspective. Sometimes the world underestimates you not because you lack brilliance, but because they lack vision. Darius Cole's story reminds us that true genius doesn't announce itself with credentials or connections. It sits quietly, works with dignity, and waits for someone wise enough to recognize excellence when it doesn't come wrapped in privilege. Vivian Hartwell's transformation shows us that our worst moments don't have to define us. They can become the foundation for becoming better than we ever imagined possible. And their partnership proves that the most revolutionary force in any organization isn't technology or capital or market strategy. It's the courage to see people clearly, value them fully, and give them the opportunities their talents deserve. The next time you feel invisible or overlooked, remember that your worth isn't determined by others' willingness to see it.